I call the member for Charlton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I enjoyed the member for Bradfield's very well-considered contribution. Unfortunately, he missed one vital point, which is you can talk about better targeting of innovation funding, but then you actually have to get away from the cut to what you're going to use the money for. And he was very silent on that because that's the giant hole in the argument from the coalition. This is an important savings measure that will better target innovation support, but only if the money is returned to supporting industry and innovation policies, which is exactly what the last Labor government had intended when they announced this measure. This bill, in effect, demonstrates the hypocrisy of the coalition. Denying the R&D tax incentive to the largest firms in this country represents another broken promise of the new coalition government. These changes were introduced to better target support for innovation as part of a way of paying for the $1 billion plan for Australian jobs announced by the previous Labor government around February this year. Those opposite are opposed to the Aussie Jobs Plan, yet they pay lip service to support for existing and new industries. They criticise this savings measure, yet they are taking it and they're not committing to the new innovation agenda. As I said, this bill represents a broken promise. The coalition, Mr Deputy Speaker, went to the last election stating that they would reverse the government's decision to make this change to the R&D tax incentive. A couple of quotes to illustrate this case. The then coalition industry spokesperson, Sophie Mirabella, said the following: Julie Gillard said this was about jobs and innovation, but this policy announcement is destroying confidence in a tax incentive that makes industry responsible for its own innovation. She went on to say that we know that large multinational companies won't be hit by the R&D tax cut. It is Aussie companies that will be struck by the cut, perversely the opposite of Labor's claim to be creating Aussie jobs. The now Treasurer, the member for North Sydney, said, and more recently the government announced, the previous government, with no warning, it was funding its Orwellian plan for Australian jobs package by cutting the R&D tax break for large companies, reaping $1 billion over 4 years. The government has become immensely unpredictable on tax policy despite the charade of consultation. So on one hand we had empty, hollow criticism from those opposite before the election, but now they're happy to take the saving, and what's even worse is they won't even put the money back into supporting innovation in this country. Yet again, the coalition saying one thing before an election and doing the exact opposite after the election. The Australian people are quickly realising that this is not the government they voted for. As I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, this savings measure is about better targeting innovation assistance. International experience as well as studies have shown that companies that have over $20 billion in domestic turnover, large companies, are able to self-fund their innovation activities. But that's not a reason to pull the funding back from them and just return it to consolidated revenue. You need to use the funding to better target innovation policy. The member for Bradfield earlier identified innovation policies and the growth of clusters and other things in other countries, whether it's Israel, Silicon Valley, Europe, and that's what this funding was going to do through the Plan for Australian Jobs. This Aussie Jobs Plan was the result of extensive consultation, primarily through the Prime Minister's Manufacturing Task Force. This was a tripartite body, not stacked with stooges of any political party. It was very representative. The chair of the it had good industry leaders such as Ian Thomas from Boeing, Phil Butler from Texter Technologies, Rebecca D. Bradbury from Kraft Foods, Mike Devereaux from General Motors Holden, Ines Willocks from the AIG. It had some very notable, world-respected innovation leaders in people like Professor Joran Roos and Professor Roy Green, and it had some very good union leadership in Dave Oliver, Paul Bastian and Paul House. And what this tripartite task force came up with this was an agenda to revitalise manufacturing in Australia, an agenda to boost innovation, and an agenda to look at what is happening around the world and take it and implement it in Australia to help business innovate and grow. And we had to fund it, and we funded it through this responsible savings measure. The $1 billion plan that this savings measure was to fund covered 3 important points. First off was backing Australian firms to win more work here and abroad, and this was through improving Australian industry participation plans, making sure that large projects in this country, projects worth over $500 million, gave Aussie companies a fair shot, gave them a chance at the start of the process to tender for the massive amount of work. Fair go by not ensuring that they didn't issue the tender specifications in overseas standards, excluding Australian companies from the get-go. This also included strengthening anti-dumping reforms to ensure that goods weren't dumped in this country at below market prices. So that was the first aspect of the plan, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this savings measure was to fund. The second important measure was supporting Australian industry to increase exports and win business abroad. And this was through the $500 million precincts initiative. Precincts or clusters have been proven overseas to be a great way of growing industry. There are strong economies of agglomeration and clustering, and we were trying to implement this and look at overseas examples as a way forward. And the precincts initiative, which would have funded up to 12 precincts around the country, the first two announced were manufacturing in South East Melbourne and food headquartered in the western suburbs of Melbourne, were two great examples of bringing together industry, both large and small, academia, the great research organisations that are in this country, and workers together to ensure that learning by doing, economies of agglomeration, cumulative and circular causation were all happening so that these industries would get off the ground. And it was a great initiative. We had well over 50 applications for precinct funding. Unfortunately, this has all fallen into a void now with the new government, and I'm certainly calling on the new minister, the member for Groom, to honour this policy, because it's not just Labor's policy. It's a policy that industry called for. It's a policy that industry championed, whether it was big industry through Boeing's, SMEs through Textile Technologies, academia through Professor Joran Roos. They're all saying this is the place that Australia needs to head in, and I'm glad the member for member for Bradfield identified overseas examples of exactly where this clustering is occurring. So that was the second arm of the plan for Australian jobs, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this tax measure was going to fund. The third arm was helping Australian small and medium businesses to grow, principally through venture capital. And the previous speaker had talked about needing to boost startups, and one way of boosting startups is through improving venture capital arrangements in this country. So the Aussie Jobs Plan had a series of initiatives to support venture capital in this country. Most importantly, another round of the Innovation Investment Fund worth $350 million that would leverage another $350 million in private sector funding to leave a $700 million venture capital fund that would help grow Aussie SMEs and make them the large Australian companies of the future. This was so important if we get to grow Australian employment. Unfortunately, this is all in jeopardy now with the new government. They're happy to take the $1 billion in funding, Mr Deputy Speaker, but not fund the very sensible, rational initiatives that accompanied it. Unfortunately, this is symptomatic of a government that does not respect industry policy, does not respect supporting innovation, and really only pays lip service to supporting the growth of new industries and support for established industries. We've seen this in the attempted abolition of $15 billion of innovation and industry policies under the Clean Energy Future Package. This included the $10 billion Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the $3 billion ARENA institution, and the $1.2 billion Clean Technology programs. All these programs were aimed at funding and supporting innovation, complementing the R&D tax incentive. In fact, the CEFC, as we heard from the chairwoman, Gillian Broadbent, recently, would actually make money for the government while it was supporting late-stage commercialisation of new technologies, something so vital if we are to compete in the 21st century. It is the countries that commercialise, that develop and commercialise the new technologies to decarbonise the world, are the countries that will prosper in the 21st century. This is why Labor put together $15 billion worth of industry policy, supported by the R&D tax incentive, and all this is under attack by the new coalition government, who, if the Minister for Agriculture in question time is representative, wants to return us to being a country built on the sheep's back, which is important. Agriculture has a vital role, but As an aside, I had a brief picture that we're in the 1950s here, where the only two things we exported were wheat and wool, and maybe in a good year iron ore and coal. And that's not what Australia is, and it's not what Australia should be in the future, and that's why Labor's reforms in the last government were very, very important. Another aspect of the R&D incentive debate is about the importance of industries that really drive innovation, that really lift more than their share in R&D, and how that flows on to the rest of the economy. And a great example of that is the automotive industry in this country. This is an industry that makes up around 5% of manufacturing employment, about 1% of total national employment, yet it does 25% of R&D in the manufacturing industry and around 10% of R&D in the national economy as a whole. And this is another industry under attack by the coalition government. This is a coalition government that has already announced $500 million being ripped out in funding before 2015, and depending on what day of the week it is, they were going to take away the entire $1.5 billion after 2015. Sometimes it was $2 billion, sometimes $1 billion. It really depended on what side of the bed the Prime Minister, the member for Indi or the member for Groom got up on. And this is another example of them ripping away support for the industry and innovation policy agenda. And it's not just about corporations, it's about workers. And the automotive industry employs 50,000 people directly and another 200,000 people indirectly. They do an awful amount of training in the manufacturing sector, and I guarantee you that if you go to other parts of manufacturing, you'll meet a fitter and turner or a welder or a production engineer that probably started at GM or Ford or Toyota. So these are just three examples of the government's lack of respect for innovation. It shouldn't come as a surprise, because what was one of the first acts the Howard government undertook when it first came into power in 1996, that was to slash the R&D tax break from 150% to 125%. So I would submit, Mr Deputy Speaker, this government has form in ripping away support for innovation policy. Returning to the main purpose of this bill, which is to restrict the R&D tax incentive to companies with less than $20 billion in domestic turnover. This was a hard decision, and it is a hard act because it means reducing support for innovation for around 15 to 20 companies in this country. I would submit, and I think the data and the advice from the Treasury and the Department of Industry is that they will generally be able to self-fund that important work. But the most important thing, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that money is returned to supporting innovation and industry policy, because we need to grow the industries of the future. That is vital. Unfortunately, the failure of the coalition to honour this great opportunity demonstrates the hypocrisy of them. It's another broken promise. They catcall, they scream, they complain when the Labor government took a sensible but hard funding decision, savings decision before the election, and now they just try and slip it quietly through in the dead of night. They try and get it through, grab the $1 billion to fund God knows what. It could be their preposterous paid parental leave scheme that rewards high-income earners at the expense of low and medium-income working Australians in my electorate. So this is an important bill. It's an important savings measure. I would urge the new government to reconsider their decision and to support the $1 billion plan for Australian jobs, because it's a plan built on what industry wants, what industry thinks will work, what international experience says will work, and that is why it's so vital that we implement that particular initiative. I commend the bill to the House.